Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we apply the practical philosophy of objectivism to everything, mostly current events. But today we're going to be talking about addiction. Now, I think the conventional wisdom out there is that addiction is a disease. If you go to a 12-step program, they talk about, say, alcoholism and drug addiction as diseases that you have no will power over. If you read the big book, even in Alcoholics Anonymous, it will refer to alcoholism as an allergy, in which certain people have this allergy that I guess commits their body to this disease in a way that other people don't. I have real problems with this issue. I personally do not think that addiction is a disease. I think that's one more way of divorcing yourself from moral agency over your life. That's not to say that addictions don't affect your body, that they can't cause dependencies, and that it can become extremely dangerous to come off of certain addictions that you have, and you have to do it guided by a physician. But namely, that's just dealing with physical discomfort and physical harms that you've caused yourself. Otherwise, to me, an addiction is a bad habit. And a bad habit is oftentimes something you engage in to avoid or evade something. Now that's sort of my overall premise. To question that, to pick it apart, to maybe even tell me I'm wrong. We've got Josh Dickson here, who is a psychologist, so he's trained in this field specifically, and he can help me walk through this issue with addiction. Josh, great to have you on the show. What do you think of this of addiction? Is it a disease? Am I wrong?
Well, it's a really good question. I'm going to preface all of this by saying, I started off my first kind of job in this world was as an addictions counselor. So I'm very familiar with 12-step programs, non-12-step programs, into various kinds of interventions. And I will just hand on heart say at the beginning that the most effective programs for addiction by far are 12-step programs. They work. And you can just look at the data on this. They have the longest outcome, the best outcome studies by far. And what I will say is if you treat addiction like a disease, it doesn't have to be called a disease. Maybe you could call it a certain kind of condition. But when it's treated like a disease, you get the best results. And it's often referred to in our circles a bit like diabetes. Now, diabetes can be self-caused, but it does then become a disease that then needs to be treated as a disease. I'm talking about the type of diabetes that comes from
adult onset diabetes from eating too much.
Eating too much and so on. And that is definitely a disease. It's chronic. Some people call it a chronic condition or a chronic disease. And I would say that addiction is very similar to that. And that analogy works very well in its treatment. And what we would say to someone is, you are still responsible for treating your diabetes. If you don't take your medicine for that or something like that, you are the one responsible for that. But you have to recognize that it is there and that it needs treating in certain ways. And that's been my experience. Now, I hear where you're saying, now in the literature of both Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, they talk about addiction being a threefold illness. It's spiritual, and that's really the part that's to do with what we would within our context, consciousness and free will. It's all to do with the decisions and your values and the way you go against your values and things like that. That it is also physical, that there is a physical element to addiction, and that there is also a mental aspect to addiction. And when they talk about mental aspect in the literature, what they mean is a particular type of obsessive thinking that seems to go hand in hand with addiction. So that's what I'll say just to begin with. And I think that I'd probably say quite a few things that probably got your mind ticking. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say or what you might want to discuss out of what I've just said.
Now, granted, I'm going to be coming at it from from the person who's been in programs and from a person who's pushed people into programs. I had a friend who tried to drink himself to death. He was definitely an alcoholic. I went over to his house after a 5-day binge that he'd had. I hadn't heard from him, so I was concerned for his well-being. I did a welfare check on him. Empty bottles of booze all over the place. He He was, it looked like he was going to be on the verge of death, and said that was his intention. I said, you got to get into a program, man. You got to get into a 12-step program. He was an atheist. He said, I can't deal with the God thing. Well, I said, look, your atheism isn't helping you now. And
Yeah.
and even though they embed a lot of religious ideology in these 12-step programs, the one thing that I think the program gives them is a philosophy, a step-by-step way of dealing with stress that they didn't have before. I found that a lot of the people that I've met in these programs have a couple of characteristics in common. Like you said, there's obsessive thinking going on that they can't seem to get a handle on. There seems to be a bit of a narcissism in the at least they present to me in the way they view the world, and the idea of service helps them step out of that a little bit, see the world around them a little bit, because they're very internally engaged. They're not really externalized. They're reactive to the external environment, but they're not really externalized in the way that we objectivists think that a person should take in their environment. And so the acts of service gets them off of that internal focus and germinating. The steps provide them with an outlook on the world and an active way of approaching the world, as opposed to the disappearing passive way of dealing with feelings that they're crushing and evading through their drug use. What say you to that?
Well, I am a big fan of 12-step programs. They are not ideal, but they are predominantly rational. And
Yes.
or most of it is rational, and it provides what a 12-step program is all about. Fundamentally, is teaching people how to take responsibility for themselves, teaching them how to take responsibility for the decisions for their past and for their future, as well as the present. And that it's a full-on program. I mean, step 4, where you're taking a full moral inventory of yourself. This is something that people rarely do. Anyone rarely does in their whole life, and so it gives people a tremendous opportunity to really explore and know themselves and do a lot of introspection.
So it's forcing them to be conscious and conscientious about their life in a way that they're using the drug of choice or the addiction of choice to numb that awareness, right? I mean, if I read a book by Stanton Samanow called Inside the Criminal Mind. He had a great deal of success in reducing the recidivism rate of criminals who exploit systems that are all about focusing on their emotions and compassion for them, because his system was about changing their thinking. And it seems like this, by way of a program that hustles in a little bit of religion, is about changing their thinking. It's about changing their orientation to themselves, making them more conscious of their own feelings and their relationship to the world.
Well, all of that's true. And they often talk about their stinking thinking that needs to be fixed. And they often talk about, when people say, oh, it's a brainwashing cult, and they'll often say, well, actually, I need my brain to be washed. That's one of the most important things. That's one of the things I've never done. The religious angle is, in my mind, unfortunate, but what it came from, some predominantly more religious types in the 1930s in Ohio, who had been very influenced by the Oxford group that had 5 steps. So when they first were formulating it, they wanted it to be like, they wanted to talk about God, and then loads of people reacted against this and said, well, it has to be the God of your understanding, and that can be anything you like. So a lot of atheists will, I don't have much truck with people who say I have a problem with the God thing, because if you actually turn up and you go and you read the literature, it's not a God in terms of the God of religion. It's basically saying not yourself. And there's actually there's something I found online, Leonard Peikoff talking about AA, and Ayn Rand even writes a little bit about AA in philosophy, The Unknown Ideal. I don't know if you remember that, but she talks about how Alcoholics Anonymous is based basically on the Serenity Prayer and how much respect she has for the Serenity Prayer.
Yes, that's a great prayer.
Yeah, it's a great, well, the beginning part of the prayer is great. If you read the whole prayer, it's a very different beast.
That's the only part I know from all the programs that I've visited.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's a great prayer because it's all about reality and being tied to reality, and how you must accept reality as the fundamental. So 12-step programs, the service element is interesting because it's basically a program basically a program about win-win. It's if I reach out to help you, I feel better. So, and the whole program was founded upon this principle that when A reaches out to B, A gets better. And and that was pointed out to Bill Wilson by his wife, that she noticed that he was trying to help all these alcoholics and they just weren't interested. But in the act of trying to help them, he was saving his own life. So a lot of people in the 12-step programs refer to the program as a program of enlightened self-interest. You'll hear this all the time. So it's not quite where you and I might want it to be, but I think the reason it's been so successful is because of the aspects of it that are tied to reality and are rational, and the bits that aren't quite so are the parts that people don't do so well with. But then
this is an interesting thing that I want to jump on real quickly, because people often tell me I'm giving back to my community because I teach acting, and sometimes I teach for free, just for the simple joy of teaching. And I keep telling them, well, maybe I'm giving back to you, but I actually learn a great deal from teaching. I actually become a better actor by teaching the principles. And the jiu-jitsu school I study in, it's all about the higher belts passing on wisdom to the lower belts. And you become better at what you do, more subtle and practiced in your techniques, just like you are rendering service to somebody who's been in the same spot that you were in a year ago. You can help them through that. That shines a light brighter inside of you as well. It makes you smarter. It makes you healthier. It makes you more capable of dealing with the reality around you, right? So I feel
100%.
Yeah. So I feel like, I don't know if we answered this yet, that addiction, I mean, you sort of said it can start out one way, but then it becomes a physical problem, of disease that you have to deal with. But is it a disease, or is it just a form of evasion, a method of coping that is an attempt to evade reality, and the program brings you to reality, forces you to see reality?
Yeah. So a recovery program forces you to see reality. Addiction is an escape, and it's an escape from usually, but not exclusively, trauma. So we talk about it a lot of the time, and when we're working with clients, when you're working in rehab, the last thing you want to be doing is really getting on someone's back and smashing them to pieces when they're already smashed to pieces. So we usually find in treatment and in therapy that should come a bit later. In the beginning, we're just like, okay, this is a situation that's, you have self-medicated something that 99% of people in the world would do themselves as well. I mean, the horror stories, the horrific things that most addicts have been through. A lot of people would be like, yeah, I don't blame them for having a drink or shooting up or anything. And it's, no one sets this. The sad thing is when you interview people and they're being in an honest place, no one sets out to become an addict. It's not something that like someone says. I mean, there are a few people who are attracted to certain novels and things, that people like to reference, but in general, no one wants that kind of life of suffering. But they're usually coming from one form of suffering, and they get temporary relief for a while, and that's what causes the dilemma in people. Because when you interview addicts, they say that they use to feel normal. They don't say I used to be high. They might say that right in the beginning when they're 13, 14, 15 years old. But 99, nearly the whole time they're reporting that I drank or I took a few pills or I did everything just so I could function, so I could be normal. And that's really sad if you think about that, like what's going on there. And it's usually rooted in trauma, but not exclusive to trauma. This is because I work a lot. I'm primarily a trauma expert these days and a positive psychologist, but I meet a lot of people. Every addict that I know and have worked with has a history of usually developmental trauma, usually terrible parenting, and some kind of event that happens in their teenage years that accelerates them to another place. But I've worked with a lot of people who are very traumatized who aren't addicts. And so there are a couple of other things going on, or at least one other thing going on. So in the AA Big Book, they talk about an allergy. In Narcotics Anonymous, there's more of an emphasis on powerlessness, but there's something that happens to certain people when they take chemicals that doesn't happen to other people. And I've seen this and witnessed this and know this to be true, that there are certain things happen to someone's brain or their nervous system or their physiology that takes them to a very different place. In the same way that people with ADHD, people who really have ADHD and they take certain stimulants, they calm down where everyone else gets hyper and manic. And there's something in addiction that addicts have this thing where once they start, they cannot stop, or they cannot predict what will happen to them. And
so are you saying that the trauma maybe rewires their system, even their brain, changes the biochemistry of their brain in a way?
I'm not sure, because the counter to that from my own experience is why there are lots of people who are very traumatized that aren't addicts, that don't have that powerless angle. So that may be the genetic part to the condition. If we want to call it maybe a condition, there are definitely people who are much more predisposed to addiction. You see it runs very strongly in families. And a lot of I know they're correlation studies, but the studies of identical twins separated at birth is quite staggering how many identical twins, if one is alcoholic, the other is alcoholic. There definitely seems to be a strong, and what it is it's not, I don't believe that it's not that there's a gene that says, hey, Mark is going to smash himself to pieces with alcohol. It may be a gene that predisposes you to some form of depression or something like that. That means, because all addicts talk about having this hole in their soul, and that they've had that hole in their soul way before they picked up drugs or alcohol, going all the way back to 5, 6, 7. Now, in the old days, they would have thought that that was probably some spiritual, quasi-religious reason for that. Now, as we understand much more about attachment theory and how kids need to bond with parents, and if they don't have that, I mean, you only have to look at kids raised in orphanages in Romania to see the damage of not having any form of even mild parental figure. And I think that's what a lot of addicts are referring to, is this emptiness that they have inside because they were never really, I've just heard in treatment, I've heard so many life stories, and the similarities are so uncanny that there definitely some very strong patterns and what's a good way of describing it? Patterns and events that people go through that seem to predispose people towards addiction.
Yeah, I definitely feel like our psyches are formed. A big part of our psyche, maybe what Rand would attribute to our sense of life, is formed at a preconceptual stage. It's so once that's sort of set in you, it's really hard to dislodge it, right? And to change it and to shift it. It takes a great deal of work to change it. And it might never, ever quite leave you, because it seems like the evaluation is at a cellular level.
Yeah, I agree. And I find this when working with trauma, that we talk about the pre and post conceptual stage of growth. So if someone is like horribly abused before the age of 7, it's very much encoded in a very deeply emotional way, that a child, when they reference that trauma, they will reference it like they were scared and they didn't really know what was happening, but it made them uncomfortable or something like that. Over the age of sort of 7, 8, which we call when kids really become much more conceptual, they're much more like, he was a bad man, that was a bad thing that happened to me. So the way things are encoded are very different at different ages. And you're quite right. You see the sense of life that a lot of addicts have a very cynical, dark sense of life. And that's one of the wonderful things about 12-step programs, is the programs often infuse a lot of joy and help people really turn around their sense of life. But I think you're right.
But do you think that joy comes from that sort of how do I say it? Like the snowball effect of doing good, and seeing yourself as efficacious in the world actually makes you feel good. And then it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling, as the opposite does. Yeah.
I see this all the time, particularly around service, that what service in 12-step programs does is it really improves people's self-esteem, because as we know, self-esteem asks 2 questions of you. Am I able and am I worthy? And a lot of addicts aren't able. They have no skills really, except hustling and maybe being charming and having the gift of the gab and all those sorts of things. But they go to 12-step meetings, which don't cost anything, and they learn they become a treasurer, and they learn how to manage money, and they learn to be a secretary of the meeting, and they learn how to talk loudly and how to run a meeting, and they learn to be a greeter, which teaches them social skills, and they learn to do the tea, which teaches them how to listen. And there's all these, so that you see people, is 12-step program is like an accelerated maturation process.
Yeah.
That's why you really see people, if they work it, do really well. But I know we've ended up talking much more about recovery than actual addiction itself. But I would say there are three causes, whether we want to call it a disease or a condition, or I spoke about this with Ben Bayer once. He said, isn't addiction just a habit? I said, well, it is, but we have different words for different extremities. We have frustration, we have anger, and we have rage. We use different words for different extremes of a similar emotional response. And I think addiction is a form of habit that has gone to a level where it's just pure compulsion. And that's why we need residential places to break that often.
So it had to start off as something that relieved the anxiety or stress for a time. Yeah. That became sort of the positive feedback, and then it just progresses and it cascades and becomes, it becomes more prominent in somebody's life until it's the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. This is what we see. And that's what when people talk about this concept of powerlessness, powerlessness has two kind of meanings. One is that when I pick up, I can't stop. And the other one is that I seem to be, without some kind of program, I seem to be powerless at stopping that progression or that cascade from happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. The concept of powerlessness and how effective it is in actually endowing the addicted person with power. I mean, we don't have much time, but can you talk about that a little bit? Because it seems paradoxical to me.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds paradoxical, but one way we say is I become empowered when I admit my powerlessness.
So you're admitting. So it's sort of a Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic, it's objectivist sort of concept. I think where the two cross is like, I'm concerned about what I can deal with, and I leave alone what I can't deal with. I know I'm powerless over some things, and I know I have power in certain arenas, and I have to distinguish between the two things.
100%. That's exactly it. And what you're talking about with powerlessness around addiction is that when I touch mood altering chemicals, all bets go, like I think Nils Lofgren, the musician, once said, my powerlessness, every time I end up in handcuffs, it's like, no matter what I try and do, I end up in this situation. That's why I don't do it. And it's like, and I like the way certain people in programs will say things like, why don't you just have a drink? Why don't you just have a drink? And they said, because I don't like who I become when I drink, or I don't like the consequences of that. I can't predict what will happen if I pick up, and it's not worth it. I value my life too much to do that.
Oh, that's a beautiful thing. I remember I did a full genetic test, and apparently I have a gene that is associated with overeating. And I see that as a potential that I don't have to actualize. Yeah. It's there. It may increase my cravings. It may make me want to eat more than I should, but I still have moral agency to act for my long-term interests. So I don't have to actualize that potential. And I like that somebody in the program sees it in similar terms. I don't like the person I become. That's a potential, and that I don't want to actualize.
Yeah. Or it was a reality that I don't want to go back to as well. That's usually, I'd say that's almost a better way of looking at it.
I know they have. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, just like the model that I like that explains addiction and where it comes from is that there are three main causes. There's the antecedent cause, which is a genetic predisposition, like you're talking about, but it doesn't mean that you become the predisposition. Trauma, that's kind of like what we call the contributory cause, something that fires off the need for mood alteration to a new level. And it's usually actually with teenagers, parents getting divorced is a big one. And then exposure. So exposure is the bit. Do you remember in the 80s, Just Say No?
Yeah.
This belief that drug dealers were at the school gates giving everyone, it's complete nonsense. But the exposure is just what you're being exposed to. So it's like in rehab, why are the older people usually alcoholics and the younger ones polyaddicts? Well, it's just the exposure, what was around at the time. but that's the least effective area to focus on. And a lot of those programs, those government programs, always just focused on the exposure element without looking at the other much more significant causes, which of course they did, you know, like
of course the government shouldn't be in that realm because they simply do not have the sophistication to be able to deal with it. We have to wrap up. Josh, there's so much we could talk about on this topic. It's very fascinating to me. I'd love to even talk more about rational recovery, how objectivism can play a part in the recovery of an addict, with the spiritual components of objectivism that help people deal with issues just like this. Because I think that's very important, because I think the philosophy should play a very big part in a person's recovery. I just have a couple of super chats here to read. Robert,
can I just say one really quick thing about genetics that I've learned about predisposition? Yes. I have identical twin girls. They are 2 years and 4 months. They have exactly the same DNA, and they are completely different personalities.
That's amazing.
Which is amazing. So it blows my mind. So I mean, they do a lot of things the same, but they are very different. So this idea that the genes determines everything is just not true, from my own experience of my daughters.
I agree too. I think that's a healthy way to look at it. They're a potential that doesn't have to be actualized. Your behavior can could push that floor, that ceiling, a lot of different directions if you take it into your hands. So Robert Nasir for $5 is definitely it's definitely about definitions. But Mark is wise to make the distinction: difficult to stop change versus impossible to stop without intervention. But I think, Josh, you made a very good point about certain thresholds that you pass, where it becomes a disease and perhaps intervention is necessary because it's so intermingled with the physical issues that it's almost impossible to come off of it without the intervention or doctor's assistant. Wes Stewart for $10 says, fascinating conversation. Thanks. Upcoming shows, folks, 6 p.m. UK time, the reality show on cancel culture of GB News. At 10 p.m. UK time, Life on Earth with Robert and Amy Nasir on Do They Want to Live? Jonathan Honig with 99 cents. Thank you, sir. Kiana Pellegrino for $1. Thank you. Josh, it was very enlightening talking to you. We have to split because we have another show coming up in exactly 2 minutes, but I'd like to review this topic again and take it a little further with objectivism if you'd like to do that.
That'd be great, and really good to see you and good to be back on the show.
Great to see you. Okay. Peace.
Take care.